Chigwell Holmes in a Scandal in Acton. An excerpt from the renowned book by Sir Arthur Conan Body. Pertaining to the events recorded by I, Dr. John Watford, being of sound mind and body, which did start to raise a question mark in my mind over certain preferences of my good friend, the famous detective Mr. Chigwell Holmes, currently resident at number 221 Beaker Street, Acton. The events recorded begin in Beaker Street just as Holmes and I have completed another 3-day marathon session of Acton Town, with Holmes defeating me for the 117th time in a row. "There's a good fellow, Watford, open the window and let some air out. Those passers-by look like they're gasping." Holmes flopped back into his chair, polishing his pipe. "I've got to hand it to you, Holmes," I began, opening the window and just failing to catch the cat as it was ejected out of the window by the explosive decompression. "Your use of the Sicilian defense protecting the circle line was masterful." Holmes replied, "You're certainly improving yourself, Watford, although it has to be said that the perceived wisdom is that Hesketh's gambit rarely secures an advantage if played before the 127th move." I made a note in my notebook. After all, that is what notebooks are for, isn't it? As Holmes was always at odds to point out. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. What on earth could that be? I mused out loud. "I think it's the door," replied Holmes. "Good grief, does that mean I no longer need to leave by the window and fire escape?" The large and cuddly figure of Mrs. Potomac, Holmes's most utterly reliable housekeeper for the last untold number of years, squeezed with some difficulty into the room. "Mr. Holmes, I am most awfully sorry to interrupt, but I have a visitor for you and she says it's most urgent." "A young lady?" The young lady that followed Mrs. Potomac had no such difficulty squeezing into the room. She was in her mid-20s, elegant, slender, dark-haired and was afflicted with a high degree of beauty. She was dressed all in purple, which did not come across at all well in black and white films. "Well, perhaps I'd best leave the three of you alone now." "No, it's okay. You can stay, Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Potomac, who promptly took her leave, and, with the assistance of Holmes, myself and a generous application of butter, she managed to squeeze out of the room, closing the door as well as could be done in its now buckled frame. Holmes turned to the attractive visitor, and was obviously already acquainted. "Mrs. Irene Aldgate, most delighted to see you again." "And you, Mr. Holmes. And you must be Dr. Watford." "At your service, madam." Throughout the course of the ensuing conversation, unless my judgment was very much in error, I developed a sense that Holmes' interest in the young visitor may have been more than just professional. Holmes gestured towards Mrs. Aldgate. "Please, take a seat." "No, I won't," replied Mrs. Aldgate, "the furniture at home does me nicely, thank you very much." "Mr. Holmes, you said you would take on my case and look for my missing husband. I have turned over to you all the clues you requested, the tin of corned beef, the cormorant, the underground ticket stub to Holborn, the receipt for Holborn High Street Men's Refuge, but since then I haven't heard from you." Mrs. Aldgate pulled out a kerchief from her purse and began sobbing into it. Listening to those words, the awfulness of the truth dawned on me. The past 2 weeks Holmes and I had had virtually non-stop sessions of Acton Town. Holmes had been neglecting his caseload. I drew my arm around Mrs. Aldgate, and, summoning my most patronizing tone, comforted her. There, my dear. It's nothing to worry your silly little head over." Mrs. Aldgate composed herself. "Yes, of course, Dr. Watford. How silly of me. I'm sorry." All eyes were on Holmes now, seeking an explanation for his apparent lack of diligence. Holmes finally broke the tension. "I'm afraid you've caught me out there. I admit I have been lax in my attention to this case. I have had rather a lot on my mind recently. I do hope you can forgive me." Mrs. Aldgate looked despondent. Well, in that case, I must say I am most disappointed. Mr. Holmes, I am no longer in need of your services. Dr. Watford, I bid you farewell. Mrs. Aldgate would have stormed out of the room had she not had to spend several moments negotiating with the broken door. I quickly broke the silence. Well, I say, Holmes, that is most unlike you to be so indifferent about a case. Not in the slightest, Watford replied Holmes. It was the easiest thing to locate the missing husband, not even a two-piper. The kidnapping was a mere ruse on the husband's behalf so that he could escape his wife because he suspected of her an affair, and being a man of some standing he did not want the scandal of a divorce. He begged me not to tell his wife of the truth. Holmes puffed on his pipe in a very satisfied manner. But that is incredible, Holmes, I replied. And did you have any clue as to the third party? I was gambling on Mrs. Aldgate removing her kerchief just now, said Holmes. And did you notice its style? It was in the man's style if I'm very much not mistaken. And more importantly, did you manage to observe the initials? Instead of E I could clearly see CH. There was a long pause, and Holmes continued. The end to this case is not satisfactory, Watford. Throughout my career I have successfully kept my personal feelings apart from my professional. That is, until I met Irene Aldgate. She is the only woman I have ever truly loved, but now I fear I will never see her again. I totally sympathize with your negative feelings, Holmes, I said. No, Watford, I fear I shall never love another woman again. Holmes paused. So from now on, I shall only know the love of men. And it was at precisely this point that I resolved to scour the small ads in the Acton Town Gazette for new lodgings.